I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Prof, the floor is yours.
You can speak.
All right. Thank you very much, colleagues. I can't see the room, but I'm certain you can see me. It's been a great 2 days of discussions, very strategic, very practical, very focused. This final session is on advocacy, engagement, strategies, and tactics as a means of making the case for the renewal of AGOA. I guess I should just start by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Bob Wekesa. I'm director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I must shout out to one of our board directors, Dr. Whitney Schneiderman, who spoke in the previous session. So in terms of moving straight into this session to save time, it is clear that the advocacy and engagement strategies will have to be approached from some form of framing and agenda setting. Over the last 2 days of discussion, and also when you look at the details, the data coming from news reporting, from policy platforms and so forth, there are at least 3 frames through which the AGOA renewal process are being viewed. And that is where I believe the framing and agenda setting approaches should come from, should focus on. The 3 frames essentially is, one is a pessimistic one, and the skepticism is that AGOA is not going to be renewed. And I think this has become almost a popular view from at least popular media. And so in terms of advocacy, leveraging the strategies of framing and agenda setting, is how do we get beyond this idea that AGOA is not going to be renewed, the heavy pessimism that has occurred. And so going into the media and other engagement platforms, how do we try to wind down on this pessimism? The second frame is essentially optimism. And I think the optimists are saying that AGOA is indeed going to be renewed. This would be great. And in terms of framing and agenda setting, this is the kind of view that one will want to amplify, one will want to advocate around, one will want to lobby for. And then I guess the third major strand has been what we may call pragmatism, that there will be a slight extension of, say, 1 or 2 years, or perhaps a little more. This was actually propounded quite a bit in the previous session. And again, this is a more forward-looking approach that perhaps we can try to amplify as well. So the question then becomes, how do we use framing and agenda setting strategies towards optimism and pragmatism, towards being hopeful and being driven by this hope to actually undertake very practical, pragmatic strategies towards the renewal of AGOA. And so, based on this, a perspective that has gained currency, in fact, in this workshop itself, but from some quarters, is that we should make the case of the renewal of AGOA by implying, by suggesting, by propounding the idea that AGOA is good for the US to start with, and therefore by extension, Africa. And I think this is one of the approaches, one of the issues, one of the pathways that our panelists are going to help us unpack. I'll just go straight to the panelists. I believe they are already seated there. To start with, we have Mr. Joe Davidson, former journalist with Washington Post, quite experienced journalist. We have Dr. Ken Simiyu, Director of Strategy and Growth at Centum Scientific Solutions. He is, in fact, a recently former staffer at USAID, so he understands the issues pretty well. We have Mr. Joe Frango, Vice President, Programs and Development, and founding President of the Advocacy Association. And lastly, we have Mr. Lon Walls, President and CEO of Walls and Associates, who is a strategic communication expert. So I will not want to weigh in too much at this stage, but rather to go straight to the panelists. I will suggest that all the panelists, each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes to unpack for us the advocacy and engagement strategies and tactics from their point of experience, from their expertise, and I'll let them then use those as a means of providing some practical way forward. So without further ado, I'll start with Mr. Joe Davidson. Over to you, Mr. Davidson.
Okay, I was saying thank you very much, Bob. I hope you can hear me now. It's good to talk with you from what I feel like is a second home in Johannesburg. As Bob said, I'm formerly with the Washington Post. I actually quit last month in protest, actually, but that's another story. I think the things that I would like to mention are some of the things that I'm sure you've already heard, and so perhaps some of this will be reinforcement, perhaps it will be something new. But the point that has been made, I think that's a very important one for this Trump administration is the need to emphasize the self-interest of the United States and specifically of the Trump administration, if not President Trump himself. When it comes to trying to get things from the Trump administration, we've seen leaders, foreign leaders this year, adopt the tactic of praise. Donald Trump, I think, is clearly known to have, shall I say, narcissistic tendencies, and I think he responds well and to what is in the self-interest of the United States and to some extent himself. And he's also known as a very transactional president. And so all of this fits together in a model that I think can affect the way foreign nations, any foreign nation, or for that matter, even people in the United States, approach this administration. One of the things we say here is that all politics is local, and so one of the things that I think is helpful is learning how an extension of AGOA can affect the people of the United States. What do the people of the United States get out of this? And so that gets to the kinds of products that Africa supplies to the United States, where those products are used, who uses those products, in what states you find those products being used, and where this trade is beneficial to the people, not just the politicians here in Washington, but the people on the ground and in the farming states of the Midwest, the industrial states of the Midwest as well. The farming states are all over the country, actually. And so it's good knowing that kind of economic geography and what helps drive members of Congress towards certain positions. But as we learned in the last panel, this is really like White House focus because the Congress the Congress, certainly on the Republican side, certainly doesn't operate independently of the White House, and that's never the case. But it's particularly true during this administration when you find members of Congress from the Republican Party, Donald Trump's own party, when they fall out with him in any way, they might be out of office. Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina is an example, who decided not to run again because he's basically on the bad side of the Trump White House. And that also happened with other members of Congress in the first term, in Trump's first term, and is now happening in this term. And so the real power center, even more than Congress, which of course remains important, is clearly the Trump administration and the executive agencies. So it clearly makes sense, I think, to devise a communications plan that speaks to the power center. Now, because the White House is the power center, that doesn't mean that there are not other really active players in Washington and throughout the country that perhaps can help you get to the power center. And that gets back to this notion of the local interests. I think that, and much of what I'm going to say, by the way, applies to the long term, because you now have like about a month to see whether or not AGOA is going to be extended or not. So there's no time to plan kind of an extended communications policy for an issue of this magnitude in a month. It just takes much longer to plan and not to mention implement. So some of what I'm going to say, some short-term elements, but it also long-term, brings about some long-term possibilities. And one of those is engaging in the organization that I'm a founder of. It's the National Association of Black Journalists. It's celebrating its 50 years this month. This year. The actual anniversary is in December. And being I tell people there's two things that I'm very proud of in my career. One is being a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, and the other was introducing my mother to Nelson Mandela before he was president, when I was posted in South Africa for the Wall Street Journal. And so the organizations like the National Association of Black Journalists can put you in touch with journalists throughout the country who perhaps can be helpful in terms of getting your message out. Again, this is part of a longer-term strategy, because there's no time to do this in the next month. But I do want to mention it because, number one, if AGOA is extended for a short-term basis, like a year or two, which I guess now seems more probable than a long-term extension, then there will be a period to implement a longer-term strategy. And the strategy applies really not just to the African Union, but this is the kind of strategies, everything I'm mentioning really can apply to any organization or policy that is seeking to get greater attention. If you work through organizations like NABJ or other journalistic organizations, you can then reach not only journalists here in Washington, but those throughout the nation. And one reason I'm pushing NABJ is not just because it's my organization, but because NABJ is made up of African Americans, and African Americans are really in tune and really want to be more connected with our African brothers and sisters around the world, and particularly on the continent. At every convention, I think we do have some panel, at least some panel that deals with African issues, and there's been many trips to Africa with black journalists. A member who used to be a UN official, Jabril Diallo, it's taken many black journalists on trips from the United States to different countries in Africa. But the return can also be the case. I mean, you can perhaps contact journalists around the country, perhaps through organizations like NABJ, and offer to talk at chapter meetings about your country or about the AU as a whole, or about AGOA specifically. And these chapters around the country welcome speakers to talk with them and to engage their members. And this is part of, like I said, a long-term strategy that would help develop constituencies around the country over Africa issues. For this particular fight, As it relates to AGOA, it seems also like you have, there has to be a two-prong approach. Because of the uncertainty of what's going to happen with Angola, and because of the Trump administration's seeming preference for bilateral relations as opposed to relations between the United States and international organizations, you have to develop a strategy for AGOA and for bilateral relations. Now, while those two are certainly have distinctions, there are definitely some overlaps, and the overlap goes back to what can your particular nation do for the United States, and in return, how will your particular nation profit from that? And so this kind of transactional dealing is really the era we're in now, and it's. You know, it's in some ways it's unfamiliar territory. In some ways, I think it's more hostile than it ever has been. I think that what the Trump administration has done to USAID makes the whole relationship with the United States and the world, but particularly Africa, a much more fraught relationship that I think, while U.S. International assistance is different from trade, there are clearly some overlaps and some commonalities there. And what has happened to USAID, I personally think, is a tragedy, but it's also the reality, and so we have to be able to deal with that. And I think it kind of makes this whole issue of the relationship between the United States and countries around the world much more difficult than it had been otherwise. And so I guess I would just conclude by emphasizing, from a communications perspective, the importance of making your case known, not just to reporters here in Washington, but over time, over the long term, trying to get out into the country to talk with journalists around the country, giving them story ideas about how perhaps people from your nation, but who live in Chicago or Cleveland or Los Angeles, putting them in touch with a local constituency, and generating ideas for things like, I was in Montreal, for example, just earlier this week, and there was an African World Festival there. And there are festivals like that from time to time in different countries. If you plug into those, that's another way to engage with the local community and also extend that to local reporters who, not that day, not that week, but maybe in the next month or the next year, those are people you will have contact with and you can reach out to and perhaps and generate stories on the local level that then build up to support here in Washington for whatever your issue might be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think you've given us a very direct and practical approach of, creating a communication strategy, perhaps short-term as well as medium-term and more long-term. One that will help us tap into the journalistic platforms, the newspapers, the podcasts, the television stations, that are present in the US, and it's great that you mentioned the NABJ, because then that seems like an avenue through which we can tap into individual journalists that we can link to the AU and to individual African countries in support of this cause. I think we'll entertain some questions for you from the excellencies in the room. But for now, let's transition to Dr. Ken Simiyu. Over to you.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, everyone. And a lot has been said about AGOA and the benefits both to the African countries and to the US. So I'll not belabor and repeat the points of job creation or security. One area I wanted to focus on is to target the intellectual brains behind the current administration, and primarily the conservative think tanks, Heritage Foundation being the primary target, because a lot of the White House currently is staffed by either former or current Heritage Foundation staff. And not only is there are other think tanks, conservative think tanks, American First Policy Institute, Hudson Institute, and their ideological leaning is really what is driving the White House. a lot of the congressional staff, MAGA type staffers and congressmen read conservative policy briefs, attend those meetings, cite them, and those are their talking points. And normally, what you see the White House advocating outside emanates from this kind of environment. So these are also intellectuals. They are not just making political arguments. Convincing them has to be done intellectually, as we've had data on AGOA and the benefits of the job creation, but we need to go beyond that, because behind the political White House figureheads, the people who will be asked, does this make sense? And it's normally an intellectual argument. So putting together data and proper arguments, not just abstract numbers, but really backed by data, because eventually they will be subjected to interrogation by those political heads in the White House. And this also extends now to the agencies that would be able to execute the American Jobs First policy. So DFC is a good example, or EXIM. These are also being staffed by former heritage, the leadership is former heritage think tank members. So their ideological thinking is along those lines, so convincing them. And we are also approaching a group that is very skeptical about globalization, very skeptical about international trade in general, but very strong on security and American First policy. So trying to message target these think tanks, through them, the White House and Congress will definitely listen to or hear what the message is. Now, the question, of course, is how then do we approach the think tanks that are really influential, the brains behind what is really driving the White House? It's open for debate, of course, because it will be attending the events or targeting individual members of the Heritage Foundation and other think tanks to see how best to understand what their talking points and also make an intellectual counter-argument to their thinking perspective. And then, of course, the second layer is the conservative media, Fox News, Wall Street Journal. I don't know if the Black Association is a conservative media, I don't know. But
well, the editorial page is definitely conservative.
Yeah, but conservative media is really another. So if either directly or through those conservative think tanks, the message can be amplified in conservative media, the Fox News and Wall Street Journal, either somebody appearing through either an ambassador or somebody appearing on Fox News, I don't know if to get an invite, or somebody a spokesman. That's another avenue that I see that can work. And then, of course, Truth Social and other conservative-leaning media outlets, because a lot of what is happening, we may make a lot of arguments, but if it doesn't reach the MAGA conservative think tanks, and a lot of them are highly educated people, so it's not that they'll just listen to talking points. They'll interrogate this data. So we need to make intellectual arguments to that. So I think I won't take long, but really focus, the real strategy should be, what is the engagement strategy? Who will make the greatest impact if we approach them? And then work on how do we then engage them, the strategy of the how. Thanks, Bob.
No, thanks, Ken. I think you've raised a very pertinent point. The default mode for most of us is to go to CSIS or Brookings or the more, think tanks that are ideologically more palatable to our African interests. But I think the point you make that we cannot run away, we cannot avoid intellectual arguments with those that have taken a more conservative view is important. I think that should go into the strategy as well as engagement with, in fact, as you mentioned, conservative media, where we can make arguments. Now, I think the point would be, how do we have a decent, forward-looking, potentially productive engagements in those spaces? But I think it's something we can grapple with as we go along. At this point, I think then I would invite Mr. Joe Frango. You can also then share your tips, your ideas along the same lines. Thanks.
I've been working in government affairs and advocacy for over 20 years. And, you know, I think the great news is that you all have heard really great ideas, both from Elizabeth before and then Whitney before. So going to reiterate a lot of those things, but then hopefully can just give you some real key things as you guys are looking down a 30-day timeline. And I think both ambassadors said great things about what really needs to be done. I mean, I think that really looking at, you know, sitting down and having conversations with each other and having a list of who you're going to target, right? Because really at the end of the day, it's not 535 members, it's going to be probably 20 to 30. And then more importantly, I think the other piece of that, it's not just the list and who's going to have the meetings, but also mapping out relationships and everybody kind of being comfortable with putting your cards on the table and saying, I have a relationship here with this person, I have a relationship with this congressional office, and kind of then being able to leverage those relationships. At this point, everything has to be on the table and you all have to be utilizing all of your resources together. So I would really take the time to have those conversations, get that list from Whitney he said that he had from the other groups, and then more importantly, then sit down with each other and say, how can we do this together? I think that would be really important. I think at this point, you guys don't have the luxury of letting perfect being the enemy of the good. I think it's better for you all to act and act quickly rather than having a perfect plan. So I would, you know, figure out ways you can just get momentum going and work with that. And I think while it is difficult and it's hard, I think embracing the America First and jobs messaging in your efforts is probably at this current moment going to be the best path. And I know that that's difficult because there's also many other great things that you all are doing and that AGOA is doing. But I think that's really the way that Congress, as well as the White House, is viewing policy right now, is that what is it doing for America and what is it doing for us to make us look better? The parties in charge, as you guys know, are very concerned about re-election in 2026. So they know that historically the party in power does not do well in the following election. So Republicans are very nervous about losing their jobs next year. So any way you can show how doing this, impact, moving AGOA forward can help their communities, that's very valuable. Another thing that's very unique right now in America is the fact that congressional leadership is coming from states in areas that have very small populations. So even though America has big, gigantic cities, those political players are not in power. The Senate majority leader is from a very small United States state, and it's very rural. The Speaker of the House is from Louisiana. Yes, there is New Orleans and some big pockets there, but the area he represents is very small and very rural. So once again, I think changing your arguments to have a rural focus or a way that can help small communities better. And I think the argument with that really honestly is pocketbooks and prices. So the way you can talk about how this will help jobs, but also will bring prices down, will be a big thing, especially as they're looking at the agenda. Another thing too, and I know this is difficult because we're all very busy, but as you're looking at the next 30 days, is trying to meet as much as possible in person. I know that members of Congress and their staff are very busy, and they'll probably try to push you towards Zoom meetings. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I think especially when it comes to lobbying Congress, having a Zoom meeting just isn't as effective. So I think if there's any way you all can meet together, bring in a few of your ambassador staff, and get an in-person meeting with that legislative staff person in that congressional office is really, really valuable. I mean, of course, if the only thing you can get is Zoom, of course, take the meeting. You guys have 30 days. But I would really, really push and make the effort to try to go to Capitol Hill, meet in person, face-to-face, so you can really make the impact on what this will do. And then the other thing too, and that's the thing too, and I know that a lot of you probably engage with firms that help you and consultants and that. I'm not a consultant, so I will tell you one of the easiest ways if you need to find out who to talk to on Capitol Hill. There's a software service. There's many of them out there. One that I use is called Legistorm. It's relatively cheap. So LEGIS TORM, like Legistorm. And that way you can type in a congressional office and look at the staffers and actually get the emails and phone numbers of those staffers. So you don't need to hire a high dollar law firm to tell you who to talk to. You can just do some research on yourself, because once again, you guys have 30 days. So trying to find those right people is really, really valuable. And then I really think the last thing is just looking at ways you can leverage powerful players. I know they talked about that in the earlier panel, but where is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Where's the equipment manufacturers? Where's the apparel industry groups? Walmart, Target. How can you guys partner with them to also be in the room with you to really push that forward? Because I think the more impact you can have, the more you're going to be able to move things forward. I know a lot of this, you're nodding your head, I appreciate that, like you know this. I just think really focusing your efforts is really, really valuable. And then figuring out partnering up together with everybody in this room is really going to be the key to your success, because you're going to have to apply a lot of pressure in order to make this happen.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think in a few minutes you've been able to give us quite a bit, almost like a list of potentialities, all the way from the 2026 elections to rural America, to first time with congressional staff and other important figures, to the discussion around doing the lobbying ourselves, or relying on K Street and the big lobbying firms, and so forth, and also getting the names of the key non-state actors, including businesses, almost by name, listing them and so forth. I think these are excellent ideas that will then go into a potential action plan. And at this time, let me then invite Lon to also weigh in. Then we'll move on to the excellencies, the diplomats, to also then pose a couple of questions. Over to you, Lon.
Everybody, I appreciate being here. Thanks for inviting me. A couple things. My background as a communications, I really was kind of a crisis communications person with my firm. I worked with AT&T, Shell Oil, Bank of America, Burger King, the U.S. Army. And in most cases, not all, but most of those cases, those were crisis situations that dealt with bad publicity, bad issues that lend itself to bad publicity for my clients, which most of the time were corporations. At that time, we're dealing with, issues dealing with the African American community for the most part, and how do we diffuse and try to make good bad situations. And I say that to say that, maybe unlike everybody else, I think you're hearing, we're not dealing with a normal situation. I mean, I'm sorry, everybody's this and that, but we're not dealing with normal administration, Congress. So we have to understand that sometimes you're dealing with not normal situation. You have to take not normal circumstances in your account and maybe approach it a little differently. And I say that, and I know Dr. Costa talked about the pessimistic view, optimistic, and then extension. Hopefully there'll be an extension. Let's hope that is the first thing, so you have time to prepare, like Joe was talking about, in terms of something more long range for the impact of what's going on. But right now it doesn't look very good. I mean, we're going into the next session of Congress with a lot of issues. As you can turn on TV any point in time, look in the papers, there's something going on every single day. And so your issues are extremely critical. Now you think about how can we get to the top of the heap, and that might be a little difficult to do right now. And I think what was brought up to us is, a lot of guys are worrying about their election in 2026. That seems to be kind of a big piece, and it's going to get bigger. And to what Joe talked about, the Tip O'Neill, the one Speaker of the House, said that famously, all politics is local. And I think we need to probably take that approach as we move forward. He talked about the National Association of Black Journalists as one organization of black journalists who are concerned. There's another group called the NNPA, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is it's the culmination of the black publishers throughout the country who have black newspapers in major cities. And I think one of the things that I hadn't heard a lot about, but I guess a concern in terms of what particular states and cities utilize your products. You know, there are probably some figures out there, but I think it may bear an opportunity for you to go back and look at that information, because one of the things that kind of struck me is you're dealing with states that have the gross products, domestic products, as large, if not larger, than most countries. So you look at states as a country, you look at California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Michigan. And so at some point in time, you may want to break off the large segment and deal with the smaller segments that influence policy, that influence elections, and probably approach it that way. I bring up California because there's so much there. There's support, there are ports there, you have large populations, large black populations, LA, Oakland, San Francisco. You have 2 black mayors in Los Angeles and Oakland. Michigan has a very favorable environment. Maryland has a black governor and it has a black mayor of the city of Baltimore. So I think you need to kind of step back and look at these smaller, quote unquote, countries within the larger country in terms of how you try to approach policymaking and influence, because you've got newspapers, and then also some cases like Arkansas is where Walmart is. So you've got newspapers, you've got corporations that are based in these states, in these cities, that you can influence just as rapidly as you try to do with the large scale piece you're trying to do here in Washington. And sometimes it might be better to, again, like all politics is local, try to break it down. I mean, you may not be able to do that in 30 days. That's a really tough order. But if you get the extension or you start that process, I think that's one of the things you may want to try to consider. And I made a list, you know, and probably you're going to get attention if there are 23 states that have Democratic governors, and 24 with Virginia if that election goes like most people think it will. They're basically presidents of those states. So why not try to approach them in some kind of way in terms of influence, support? And then you've got, like I said, you've got cities like New York, New Jersey, or cities in those states that have black mayors. So I'm just saying you may want to try to look at this thing from a micro standpoint in terms of if you get to the extension. That's the piece right now that's really, really important because of the time factor. But even if not, you can start the process because, again, education is the key. Admittedly, and I talked to Dr. Wakasa about this, is that, I didn't know a whole lot about this when I first started out, but I did a lot of research. And I think education is always a key in public relations. You got to educate your audience. You got to educate your constituencies so that they know exactly what you're talking about, what's important. And I think the one thing, even though it's a shame, but it's the attitude of the administration, what's in it for us? Well, break it down to a more localized version of what's in it for Los Angeles, what's in it for Oakland, what's in it for New York, what's in it for that state, New York or California or Colorado or Arizona. So I think it's a matter of, if you can do research in terms of what states and what cities utilize your products most, and then target those particular entities for a kind of an all-out pitch, short term and then also long term, then you're talking about op-eds and editors and reporters in those respective cities and those respective states that can get the message out as well. What's important, if it means jobs, if it means opportunities for folks in America, for the U.S. And then also what it means for the countries in Africa that are involved and how important it is. So I think you've got to kind of refocus, I think, your attitude and your approach. And the other thing is, what I didn't hear much of, I wasn't here yesterday, but social media is a huge, it's a megatron. You can't, obviously the president uses it as his bullhorn every single day, much to our chagrin, but he's using it. So you've got now social media is overtaking almost everything. So you've got podcasts, you've got a whole lot of different platforms. I mean, business platforms and whatnot. So I think that those are areas to look at as well as trying to get the message out, because that way you're penetrating beyond the noise to specific audiences. So I think a little research in terms of where you deal with and who you deal with in terms of social media will help as well. So that's just kind of my short-term approach to looking at this. And this is, obviously it's a crisis. This has got short-term and long-term or mid-term impact. But I think, again, you got to look at things as how do you localize this? How you can benefit from the localization of what's going on. That's my piece.
Thank you very much, Lon. I think from your input, it looks like we shall have to consider and think very carefully about a strategy that is directed towards White House, towards Congress, towards DC more broadly. But at the same time, we have to consider ground-up approaches. And I think you've given us quite a couple of ideas influencing, regions, cities, and states, using social media, therefore, a kind of digital diplomacy, digital communication strategy as well. And I think these will be very important considerations, going in as we prioritize what is practical in 1 month and what is practical in the medium term and in the longer term. I think at this point, we'll just move straight to the excellencies. If you have any questions, any comments. Unfortunately, I can't see where the comments might be coming from, so I'll seek assistance from Chargé d'Affaires Tarek. If you can assist at this stage in identifying who wants to pose a question, make a comment, make an addition, that would be helpful. But I think our panelists have really given us quite a bit to chew on in terms of communication strategies that help us frame and set agendas. Over to you.
Thank you, Bob, for leading this very important panel. I think this is the first time we have it. I mean, bring practitioners, specialists on advocacy, on international government affairs, journalists who provide us first-hand perspective on the best way to frame this issue, to set them on the agenda at all layers of government, and levels. So I want to thank you on behalf of the ambassadors and my colleagues here present today. So would like to open the floor for ambassadors, colleagues who would like to share comments, insights, questions, concerns. So the floor is open, and I will act as a moderator on your behalf, Professor. So the floor is open. Go ahead. Yes, Ambassador.
First, number one, very great insights that you've shared, the four of you, and thank you for coming to share this with us. I like the inputs about engagements with states, and also the comment about us putting all the cards to the table. It's about relationships. Yeah, there's some work we need to do also on our side in terms of doing some research on ensuring that we're targeting the right people who will advocate this very strongly. The item about the think tanks, it's a brilliant idea, actually. Yeah, it's something that we need to package it well. Yeah, as you said, you're going to engage with a lot of intellectuals. So these are people, by the time you're engaging with them, they've got a lot of information. Yeah, so we also need to go there well coordinated and with a very strong, you're in communications, most of you. The message has to be right, yeah, to be able to get the right outcomes. And it's going to be a bit complex on the social media because of the time of day. Yeah, we just have 34 days now. 34, right? 34. 34 days. In 34 days, I'm not sure how much impact, and also getting the coordination amongst all the countries. could be complex, but there could be some possibilities. We obviously leveraging on experts like yourselves can help us take us much more forward. Any suggestions, or for example, one item I'd like to see is how do you see us as AU or different cards? Is it similar to how we put our cards on the table on the relationships, on engaging with the think tanks? How best do you think we'll be able to get the best outcome from this?
No, I think it's on the think tanks.
Yeah, so because my point was that we are also engaging a reasonably hostile type of think tank, not the more friendly type of think tanks. Engaging them is requires a more different approach, because they have to really buy into, they're already skeptical in the first place, and they also have data that, in their opinion, is correct. I mean, that's deeply ingrained data, and they are the driving force towards what a lot of what the White House is doing. Is behind it is actually backed by some data. It may be skewed, it may be false, but there is some data. So as the AU, of course, and I'm just putting out there, perhaps we need to do some research on what exactly are they thinking, what data do they have to back their current narrative, and then develop a counter argument to match what they are doing. So I know the time is limited. Of course, that would be commissioning some research assistants to really dig deep into what the conservatives are thinking, the data they have, and the data they are presenting, and then creating a counter argument point by point. That's what I would advocate for.
If I could just add a bit to that, one of the things about think tanks and conservative organizations here in the United States is, while Donald Trump has managed to totally, or at least almost totally, remake the Republican Party into basically the MAGA faction is now basically the Republican Party. There remain Republicans who don't buy into all of his programs. And the paper where I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, I was not on the editorial side. I was a reporter and foreign correspondent in Africa. But the editorial page and the editorial section of the Washington Post, for example, while very conservative, does not go along with Trump on a number of issues, and perhaps the most prominent one is tariffs, which of course relates directly to trade. And so one of the things you have to be aware of is that while organizations like Heritage, which is considered as probably the most prominent conservative think tank, it's in some ways it seems interchangeable with the White House now. But the fact remains there are still some influential conservative outposts that don't go along with Trump on the issue of trade specifically. And so, you know, if you were able, for example, to get an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, that could be very influential. And if it's on the issue of trade, you might find the people on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal very open to programs like AGOA, because there are still conservatives in this country who believe in free trade and lowering the barriers as much as possible, as opposed to Trump, who now has command of most of the Republican Party, but of course he believes in very high tariffs, which he has imposed. And so it's good to know kind of where the individual players are on the issue that you're trying to promote.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Perhaps my question would be on the national security lenses and how this lens, as well as the critical mineral one, would move the needle of the argument, and how can it be framed in this current political environment, but also a point which is very important to us, the regional and continental dimension for the administration dealing with the whole continent of Africa, and the value proposition that Africa brings to the US, even within that frame of reference of the transactional approach. You, as a communication specialist, how do you frame such such a new paradigm that we are taking to the administration, that it's in the U.S. interest, national security interest, to deal with Africa as a continent because of the value proposition of Africa as a whole market, as a bargaining power, but also as a block of vote in the multilateral system will provide. So I am eager, if you have any idea that you can share, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
I mean, I think, not being a defense expert, but I think the challenge of China is very, very apparent, and I think that probably needs to be stressed and articulated more. Their investments in Africa already and their involvement, and if you kind of couch that as from a national security perspective, it should get people's attention. That really is, I mean, that's the thing. If you're going to be coming from that direction, then you look at our challenges, and that's the number one challenge. I mean, it's a fact, and they're well embedded and continuing to do so. And they're not just involved in trade; they're involved in infrastructure as well. And so I think that's something that needs to get more attention.
And on the issue of national security, as many of you in this room know, the United States has national security interests all over the world, including in Africa, including bases in Africa. And there are conflicts in Africa that the United States has an interest in resolving, and Trump likes to take credit for resolving wars and what he's called pre-wars all around the world. But it's going to be very difficult, I know, because I was in the Oval Office when President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa was there. And I thought he came with a very solid approach in terms of how to approach this particular president. This whole issue of Afrikaners being attacked. It was for somebody who, as an American who lived in South Africa, I mean, it was really revolting to me, honestly. And it was, my point is that even when you come with a very basically a well-produced program, as Cyril Ramaphosa came with his ministers, including a white minister from the DA to show that no, we're not racist and all of this. I mean, it seemed to me that they really had a good program, and then they were ambushed, in the Oval Office by a bogus video that purported to show, represent the deaths of Afrikaner people. I mean, I hate to say it, but frankly, my personal view is, and since I'm no longer, writing for the Washington Post, I think I can just say Trump is not a person to be trusted. You can go with the best program that you can develop to convince him, and he might turn around and ambush you. And so that clearly makes your job not just more difficult, but it's totally unpredictable. Because you don't really know, who you're going to get if you have an audience with Trump. You should probably expect the worst, however, and then hopefully that you won't get the worst, because purportedly he can also be very charming, and so maybe you don't get that side, but. I guess I would encourage you to talk with your South African colleagues, and I see somebody here from South Africa. To maybe they learned something from that experience. I found it. I guess if I called it very troubling, it would be about the best way I could put it.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah. So, you get the feeling that the current administration believes in national security as insulating America from the outside. So whether it's immigrants or whether it is trade or others, that America probably on its own, so long as you have a shield of some sort, you are protecting yourself. So the narrative that has been talked about, the supply chains, the critical minerals, that really needs to be amplified again, and through my favorite topic, the think tanks, because they are the ones who really are driving a lot of this agenda.
Let's.
Mine is just a comment, maybe. I like the idea that we should target conservative media. You know, I think that's very important. Your Fox News, your Wall Street Journal, and the like. And what Len also said about social media. They're very influential mega podcasters, you know. You are Joe Rogan and the like, you know. They are very influential and powerful and go a long way to shape the current administration's policy. And I think it's sound then to target those channels. But again, the messaging, I think is very important, you know. We have very limited time, and it's likely that any individual you'll meet, you'll not meet again within the next 30 days, you know. And you should maximize the little time you get to drive the message that you want them to understand. And as long as you don't shape your message correctly, you know, you can talk all you want, but it don't get you what you intend to achieve eventually. And in that regard, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we have made in the past is that we approach AGOA advocacy from the lens of Africa's lens. And with this administration, certainly that doesn't fly, you know. It should, as far as possible, align with the inward-looking agenda of the current administration, the America First agenda. And I may throw in a few pointers, because I think we can't go all over the place, you know. I would equate the space we have with an elevator pitch, you know. You have just a few minutes to make sound proposal that calls for attention of the receiver, you know. So I may point 3 or 4 issues that I think are of strategic importance and can get attention of the current administration. One is China, you know. If you mention China in the US, you immediately get attention, you know. And it's important to demonstrate that AGOA being the only economic channel between US and Africa, if you don't extend AGOA, you leave a vacuum, you know. And China is available and ready to exploit that vacuum, and it already is, you know. I'm not sure if the panelists are aware that China has already adopted their own AGOA program, you know, something similar to AGOA, you know, that allows Africa to export duty-free to China. And this came right in the midst of the current uncertainty. So you can see that they are ready to exploit the vacuum. Another thing, the biggest issue that I've noticed with the current administration is that they don't see value in AGOA, you know. And as Ambassador Creed said during his confirmation hearing, they see this as a giveaway, you know, that is of no value to the U.S. and American citizens. And to change that narrative, I think it's important to demonstrate, like we were discussing yesterday, that for every $1 billion of exports to the U.S., that creates 7,000 jobs in the U.S., you know. So that fits correctly, properly with the America First agenda. AGOA creates a lot of jobs, not just in Africa, but in the US also. And like Paul mentioned earlier, since the adoption of AGOA, the volume of American exports also to Africa has increased, and somehow there's a correlation between that and AGOA. And maybe lastly also on the security, as Tarek asked, on the security issue, if you read Project 24 and if you listen to President Trump, they are passionate about regional stability, security, and peace around the world. They are passionate about that. And AGOA, if you look at AGOA members, there's been general stability in around AGOA members, and that the economic progression is correlated to peace and stability, And if you have AGOA, you have stability in the region, and that stability in the region also curbs economic migration, which is another issue that's very, very key issue for the current administration, the issue of migration, So with programs like AGOA, you're able to curb economic migration to the US. So those would be my pointers. That, like I said, I think it's an elevator pitch moment. You can't throw everything. You just have a few minutes to make your point between now and the 30th. Thank you.
I think, Ambassador, you captured our elevator pitch very well, and thanks to the insights and the contribution of our distinguished panelists. And I would like to return the floor, the virtual one, to Professor Wekesa to close the session. It's yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shaje, the affairs, and fellow panelists. My apologies that I couldn't moderate this and I swung it back to my brother Tarek, in kind of an ambush. But of course, Tarek is very good with running with things, even in impromptu version. But I suppose to round off this discussion, what is emerging very clearly is that we need an action plan, and that this action plan will not necessarily be a very long-term one. It will be something that has to be developed by probably next week, maybe over the weekend. It is almost that serious. And I think I like the ambassadors, who has just commented, giving us actually the four main areas around which our panelists, being communicators from various domains, because you need an approach that includes PR and strategic communication, journalistic approaches, meaning, popular media and so forth. I think we've brought in the idea of the intellectual spaces, as well as, tapping the more conservative media. And I think that then kind of gives us a clear picture of some of the issues that have been discussed by the panelists. Perhaps will not be very practical in 30 days, but we have to kind of not discard them, but understand that there's life after 30th September. But in the immediate, the strategies that we've had from our panelists have to be really focused, and I think on issues of the China threat, as it usually is called, on critical minerals, on issues of framing and setting the agenda around American interests, and of course the whole issue of national security. I think those will be some of the ideas that will go into the report. But at this moment, I would like to thank the panelists, and maybe you can give them a round of applause as they leave the stage. Thank you.
dear brother Chris, Deputy Ambassador, Ambassador and Deputy Chief of Mission of Embassy of Kenya, my partner on this exercise, and our esteemed panelist, Elizabeth Hoffman, who is the Executive Director of the One Campaign, and very good friend. I had the chance to work with her when she was on the Hill. So welcome for the second day of our workshop on AGOA's interest and priorities in the United States that aims to enhance our engagement and advocacy efforts. So yesterday was the first day of the workshop, where the focus has been on providing zoom out, if you like, on the political, economic, foreign policy, national security stakes and priority related to AGOA from a very well-versed expert. So today we'll devote the second day for zooming in and looking at the dynamic, the political dynamic, the processes and procedures, where Elizabeth will provide us with an overview, because we believe that the context is very important, and the good knowledge and the deep knowledge of the context will determine the approach, the process. So the session is very important in setting the scene for today's workshop. Without further ado, I want to invite my dear brother, Ambassador Kiriga, to provide his remarks. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, my brother. First, number one, thank you for convening this, and we truly appreciate the work you've done. And yesterday was an amazing day. Thank you, Ambassador, for leading such an amazing session yesterday. Excellencies, esteemed leaders of the Africa Diplomatic Corps, respected scholars, partners from the private sector, civil society champions, and friends of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is indeed a privilege to welcome you to Africa Union Mission as we inaugurate day 2 of this landmark workshop on AGOA. Interests and priorities are key. We meet at a pivotal moment, not only for African nation and the United States, but to the trajectory of global partnership in the 21st century. Let me begin by acknowledging yesterday's proceedings, which were very enriching. I found the sessions yesterday very enlightening. We picked up a lot of thought leadership from all the panelists that came in yesterday, and was very fruitful for each one of us. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of most of us here. Excellencies, colleagues, as we reflect on the 25th year on AGOA, the evidence is compelling. In 2022, trade between the United States and AGOA, eligible African countries, exceeded $46 billion, with Africa exports reaching $30 billion, of which $10.2 billion benefited directly from AGOA duty-free provisions. Non-oil exports from Africa and AGOA rose just about $1.4 billion in 2001 to nearly $7 billion in 2022. Proof of genuine diversification. This is from Brookings. For the U.S., exports to Africa surged to $32 billion in 2024, up by 12% from 2023, supporting American jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, high-tech industry, and aviation. This is from the USTR website. These statistics confirm AGOA is a win-win framework. It deepens Africa integration into the global value chains while providing the United States with new markets, resilience of supply sources, and strengthening geopolitical partnerships. The country, for example, to make the story personal, Kenya's apparel exports to the United States grew by 55 million in 2021 to more than 600 million in 2022. Now that presents nearly 68% of US bond exports by World Economic Forum. South Africa automotive exports to the US increased by 450% between 2021 and 2022. Lesotho, AGOA apparel exports account for 60% of its GDP, sustaining jobs, family, and national stability as presented by Brookings. At this defining moment, Africa must bring three priorities to the table: unity of purpose, transformation through value-add solutions, and lastly, vision beyond 2025. Renewal must be more than an extension. It must be a bridge to the future. With African Continental Free Trade Agreement now operational, AGOA should complement Africa's internal integration while preparing the ground for a modern, reciprocal US-Africa trade framework that reflects shared standards, sustainability, and ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, AGOA's fate will not only be decided by chance, it will be decided by our ability to engage with the United States Congress administration with evidence, conviction, and unity of purpose. We must show AGOA it's not a charity, but smart economic. It creates jobs in Alabama and Addis Ababa. It supports farmers in South Dakota and Kenya. Alike, it strengthens supply chains from Detroit to Durban. In an era of geopolitical uncertainty, AGOA is proof that when Africa and America work together, we build resilience, prosperity, and trust. Excellencies, dear friends, history will judge our stewardship on this moment. Let us ensure that this workshop is not merely an exercise in dialogue, but an engine of change. Let us deliberate with depth, purpose, bold and actionable strategies, and speak with unity that inspires confidence in Washington and beyond. With resolve and vision, AGOA's renewal can become a springboard for a new era of US-Africa collaboration, anchored in evidence, equity, and shared destiny. May our discussions today chart confidence and a pathway forward. We truly thank you for yesterday's discussions, my good brother, and we look forward to another enriching conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for such a compelling vision on our relationship with the United States. Definitely AGOA and its nexus with the African CFTA is a compelling framing. But also I take the unity of purpose message that you convey to all of us, and how we need to come from this 2 days workshop with clear, actionable ideas that will enhance our diplomatic engagement and our advocacy. I would like now to give the floor to my dear friend Elizabeth. Those who perhaps did not have the chance to meet her and to work with her, Elizabeth now is the Executive Director for North America One Campaign, as I said. She has a very extensive experience in government relation and international policy. She was Director at CSIS before that, but also she held numerous positions in the House of Representatives, and they bring to us a very first-hand experience and wealth of knowledge on the dynamic within Congress, on the processes and procedure. Elizabeth, thank you for taking the time and for your insight. These 2 days workshop, Professor Wikisa and myself, we value them very much. The floor is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here. And I hope, perhaps, I don't know exactly how much time I have. I'll be brief, but I would love to hear questions as well after I give maybe some opening thoughts and reflections. So as the ambassador mentioned, I'm currently the executive director for North America, which is both US and Canada, for the One campaign. And we advocate for healthier lives and economic opportunity in Africa. I started this position last October. So it's been an interesting several months for me, as I know it has been for you all in this atmosphere. I have to say I was expecting kind of the outcome of the elections, but I wasn't expecting the pace and scale, I think, of some of the changes that we've seen to date. And as I suppose a Washington insider, which is not a popular thing to be, but that is what I am at this point. It surprised me. It was difficult to cope with. And so I can only imagine the position that you all have been in these past 9 or so months, and commend you for your work that you're doing. So I think most of you are probably familiar, but I'll just give a brief kind of, I don't want to give a history of AGOA, but just the past year, kind of where we're at. You know, we were essentially at the finish line last December. There was a deal in Congress to reauthorize AGOA. We all thought it was going to happen. I think, you know, we had certainly some members of our board and others making calls. And at the very last minute, it was crushed by the U.S. Trade Representative under the Biden administration. So it did not ultimately make it in the package. And I think that is, and then we are where we are right now with the Trump administration and what's happening with trade. So what that tells you is there's bipartisan dysfunction on our trade policy, frankly, from both the Democrats and the Republicans at this point, where we have, you know, it used to be historically that Republicans were kind of the party of pro-trade, Democrats more not, I don't want to say opposed to trade, but definitely more on the labor side, protectionist, perhaps is the best word. And we are at a point now where in the center, I think there's Republicans and Democrats that are pro-trade, although they won't, frankly, often admit that publicly. Pro-trade is not a good thing to be in this moment. And then you have kind of the two wings, the far left and the far right, who have become increasingly more protectionist. And the president, who campaigned on that, right? He campaigned on America first, protectionism, bringing jobs back to the U.S., onshoring, all of these things. And so I think it's a very hard thing to be in Washington at this moment, pro-trade. And that's a bit of the political dynamics that I think you have to contend with when talking about AGOA. And even for those members of Congress in particular that are pro-trade, I think it's important to equip them with the talking points, many of which Ambassador Chris, I think, laid out about, because they will get attacked. So what are the talking points that they can use to defend their position if they want to reauthorize AGOA? And it's about the jobs in South Dakota, the jobs in Alabama. How does this benefit the United States economy, the United States consumer? China, I think, is an important thing to bring up about, you know, after reciprocal tariffs were imposed by the Trump administration, well, in some cases unilateral tariffs, you know, China dropped all tariffs. I think that's an important thing to remind members of Congress that most of them, I mean, the one bipartisan issue you have in Washington, D.C. right now is concern about China and the influence about China. There's not much, I think, that the Republicans and Democrats agree on these days, but that is one of them. So reminding them that, you know, as the U.S. pulls back, China sees an opportunity and is actively seizing that. I saw a compelling map on Twitter, actually, and I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but it showed U.S. trade with Africa in the 2000, and basically U.S. was the top trading partner for almost every single African nation. And then it showed the top trading partner for all the African nations in 2024, 2023, almost all of them China. that was a very compelling visual. I think something, again, that is useful to use as you make your case to members of Congress. I'm going a bit out of order of my outline here, but when thinking about the dynamics of how this could play out and how an extension could play out this Congress, in the Senate, you have something called single committee referral. So any piece of legislation that's introduced is ultimately referred to one committee. In the House, it's much more chaotic and complicated. Legislation can be referred to many committees. So with AGOA in the Senate, there's the single source. So really, you can focus on one committee. You can focus on those members who will be the most important in pushing it forward. In the House, not only are there more of them, but right now AGOA has been, let's say members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Ways and Means Committee, and to some extent the Financial Services Committee, all feel like they have a piece of AGOA. So that means there's a lot more people to talk to, there's a lot more people to convince, and a lot more potential obstacles to come in the way when dealing with the House. So I would urge you to go through the rosters of those committees, figure out, who are the members that care most about it. Also, when looking at your countries, and I was just discussing this with somebody, it's very difficult to find data on AGOA about kind of what are the specific industries, what are the companies that have benefited from it. But if you know for your country, what U.S. Companies and industries does it most support? Do you have the most trade with? I would go to those members. I would focus on those individuals and really make the case to them. And in many cases, I assume they don't know that these relationships are happening about the trade with their companies. Even better, frankly, I know that the clock is ticking, so there's not a lot of time. But if you have relationships with the companies in the US that benefit from AGOA, getting them to come and join you in meetings, asking them to come and join you to tell their stories about, how many people are they able to employ? What revenue increase do they get from trade with Africa? All of those things, as you can make it as specific as possible to that member, their constituency, their district, their state, in the case of the Senate, I think all of those things are very compelling. The thing that I find the most useful in advocacy is the data coupled with the stories. Without the other is good, but it's not great. It's having those data points and then having the personal stories that go along with it that I think really moves the needle and can compel people to act. In your engagements with the Hill, I would also urge you talk to the staff. Even if you can't get a meeting with the members of Congress, the staff play a very, very important role. Sometimes you have better conversations with the staff. Oftentimes, as I'm sure many of you know who have engaged on the Hill, members have very short attention spans. So you get maybe a 15-minute meeting, maybe a 10-minute meeting. Oftentimes it can go off the rails and they start talking about something completely different than what you came to talk about, and it's hard to get them back on track. So oftentimes you can have more productive conversations that yield more benefits when you do meet with staff. I know protocol-wise, it can sometimes be uncomfortable as an ambassador to meet with the 22-year-old, the 25-year-old staffer on the Hill. And it is what it is. I was one of those staffers. Actually, that's how we originally met. But I can tell you that oftentimes I could get more out of my boss when I had a meeting with somebody and then was able to take it to him in a way, and we would actually get better results versus when he had the meeting, at least first. So I urge you to really cultivate those relationships, develop those relationships. It will take a lot of education. Staff now, they were young when I was on the Hill. They're even younger. They're even less experienced. They're even less knowledgeable. So please, it's patience, it's explaining things. I would assume most of them probably don't even know what AGOA is, aren't even tracking it. So, come in prepared to explain that along with, what are the things that benefit their boss, that benefit their district. But it is worthwhile to develop those relationships. And we actually, I'll make this plug for us as well. We just launched a congressional fellowship program that's specifically kind of on U.S. Africa. We have 16, I believe, Republican and Democratic staff who applied that we accepted. We're launching this next month and would love to kind of coordinate with all of you to possibly do something that you could meet and engage with some of these folks. They're an impressive group of people, again, bipartisan. So we'll put a plug in for that. If you have interest in speaking with them, perhaps we can do a reception or something like that. But I think it would be a good opportunity to meet with staff that have actually professed an interest in Africa. But it's funny, my colleague who was actually, reviewing the applications, doing the interviews, she was like, the knowledge level is so low. So just know that going in. And frankly, it's probably quite low for the members of Congress as well. There's about 5 or 10 members who have a deep knowledge and expertise on Africa, very few beyond that. And I think one of the mistakes that the foreign policy community in general, including organizations in this town that work on foreign policy, make is always going to the members who will be friendly and who have that knowledge. It's good to keep up those relationships, but I think educating the members, engaging the members who are less friendly is really important. It's very easy to, as a member of Congress, to criticize, to defund programs, to do things like that when you've never met or interacted with a representative from that community. When you have that personal relationship, it's much harder for them to have those conversations. So I urge you to, again, make an effort to even reach out to and meet with the members in the offices that are more hostile, less friendly. I think those are the most important meetings you can actually have. And I think sometimes surprising too. Some of them won't be surprising, some of them won't be pleasant, but the good news is, it's 30 minutes. So, it's a very, very short time to have an unpleasant conversation. Yeah. And I've been there, believe me. I've been there and I've had those conversations. But I previously worked at an organization, a federally funded organization, which is now being targeted by the Trump administration, the National Endowment for Democracy. And the most productive meetings we had were the members who were most hostile. And I'd say we won over 50% of them. There was some that didn't move, but that's 50% more than we had going in. But I think I hopefully touched on all of the points that I wanted to make, but would love if you all have questions, would love to hear from you. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for this is a very practical overview of the how to move agenda and how to move the needle, as you said. So I would like to open the floor to their excellencies, the ambassador colleagues who would like to ask questions, make comments, and so the floor is open. I see my colleague from South Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I really appreciate that insight. And South Africa would like to take up the offer to partner and present to the 16 staffers that you talked about, particularly around the misinformation about what's happening in South Africa. My question is, for a long time, we get this recommendation and advice to speak to the members, speak to the Hill, target the staffers, speak to USTR. In our case, we have explained a lot, and when you see the USTR and NTE report, the same issues around market access still appear. It sometimes feels like the US or the industry associations do not want to accept our domestic law, our customs regulations. And they want to go around that and we're trying to explain this is how things are done. I think right now we're trying to re-strategize and approach exactly the industry associations that bring the concerns to the Congress. And I would just wanted to find out from you, is that a doable approach? Most of them might not be in Washington, therefore we have to travel to states because there's only so much you can tell the staffers, and you hope they would bring the message across, but you find out some of the policy views of the members have not changed. So we're trying to target the industry. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a very good approach. You all are in an unenviable position. I think, you know, from the get-go with this administration, it became clear that there was a specific agenda on South Africa. So you have, and, you know, I think a lot of that, frankly, can be attributed to Elon Musk. Just to be completely honest, I don't think the president himself, do you think he like, I hope this isn't being recorded, but I'll say, I don't think Donald Trump has deep held principles and values on much of anything. And that's both good and bad. Because the good part of that is you can change him. It's all transactional. He's not going to stick with something because this is what he has a strongly held belief on, because he truly, you know, believes that. He's doing it because, you know, again, whoever the last person was that he talked to told him this, he has a business partner or a family member or something who's gotten to him and put this in his ear. And again, so I think the good news about that is if you get to the right advisors, if you are able to kind of help shape that message, then he can change. It is very personalistic with him. So it is all about the people. Who are the people that are close to him, around him, the family members? You know, right now on Africa policy, frankly, I don't think it's being driven out of the State Department. I don't think it's being driven out of the NSC. It's very clearly being driven by one individual who happens to be the father-in-law of his daughter, Masoud Balouz. So that's not typically how things are done in Washington. That's how things are happening in this administration. So if I had one meeting to pursue, you know, that would be the meeting I would pursue. I think he probably has the most influence with the president right now on Africa. And that could change. As you saw, Elon Musk had an enormous amount of influence for the first several months of this administration and is now PNG'd. So it changes on a dime. But at the moment, that's who it is, and that's who I would focus on and figuring out what makes him tick. I mean, he's a businessman. He, you know, Lebanese, Nigerian. What are the industries that were important to him? What did he focus on? And kind of getting those messengers into him, I think, could be potentially influential. Again, I think South Africa is in a uniquely difficult position just because of what happened at the beginning of this administration. I do think it can be overcome with quite a bit of effort. And again, figuring out who are those key messengers, who are the key people to get to start to change that narrative.
Thank you. Very good insights on that. Let me just weigh in here. Yesterday, we talked about a non-traditional pathway of advocacy because of what's currently happening right now. Yesterday, I reflected on what was stated about critical minerals and linking them up with AGOA. I think we need to look at how we can leverage on some of our member countries who've got critical minerals and leverage on that, for example, on DRC. DRC has a huge impact and they're on the table right now. We can leverage on that as a strength and an opportunity for trade-off. Yeah, Angola too. Yeah, with Lobito corridor coming in. Yeah, so if we're able to bring these ties together, I think we can make much bigger progress as a joint team. The last point I want to touch on here is in terms of when you look at U.S. private sector, the likes of Target. The likes of Target are if AGOA is cut off, the supply chains will be impacted. and goes back to the point of how many jobs are going to be lost if that happens, or how will it set them back? And those messages need to come on the table. And lastly, I'd like to say is that, can we rally behind anyone who's ahead in this game? Like, for example, right here, Paul. Paul has been doing some extremely good work on AGOA. Yeah, more than AGOA, actually. But when we have Paul who's got access and he's got some thought leadership on this, my view is we should all come together and rally behind these experts. So like when Paul is going to the Hill, I think around in a couple of weeks, I believe, a number of us should actually step up and go with Paul. Yeah, because we need to ensure that this thing succeeds. Lack of AGOA, actually, I just had Paul this morning. You actually made me a bit depressed. Paul was just telling me how you might think a 10% tariff is okay, but actually without AGOA, you actually become completely uncompetitive. Yeah. So we need to look at it in two folds. Is one, we need AGOA to remain. Secondly, we need to look at how do we bring other parties to the table. But we cannot, one should not be dependent on the other. Both are very critical. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your Excellency, Ambassador of Madagascar.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you for your presentation, Elizabeth. Embassy of Madagascar is willing to partner with you on our offer of partnership. I just want to raise a point because lots of meetings that we already have around AGOA, lots of working on the Hill to meet congressmen, staffers, also USTR, all of those key stakeholders. So my question is a very practical one. At this stage of, all of those meetings, should we then provide with like a strategic paper to the Hill to assist on decision making? Because it's like lots of talks, but I don't know if there is something that we need to provide with. There are lots of strategy that we discussed during the 2 days, yesterday and today. Critical minerals, for example, is one of the things that we have on the table to discuss and to deal with. So it's just a question that I'm raising here because today we are going to end up these meetings, today's workshop, and what comes next. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It seems like there is missing piece on those negotiations. For example, during the tariff negotiation, each country provided with deal making. So with AGOA, what documents should support the discussion with the Hill to move on? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would urge you to think about a joint letter signed by every single ambassador to the US from Africa. It doesn't have to be super detailed, but explaining some of the key points that the ambassador laid out, the jobs, the economic returns to the US, and the importance of renewal of AGOA. And I think that would be an extremely powerful thing to be able to share with offices on the Hill, to send to every single member of Congress saying, as a unified, African continent, this is important to us and it's important to you. And I would really emphasize that piece of it. Again, what are the job losses? What are the financial losses to the US if AGOA is not renewed? And again, it doesn't have to be long, 1 page, but I think, again, having all of those signatures on there would send a really powerful message for the importance of this to your countries. And so, and with Capitol Hill in particular, I don't think you have to go into as much detail on the strategy, on, a roadmap, a plan. I would frankly, there's a couple of key committees you might have some of those conversations with. And I would save a lot of that for the administration because members, they just don't have the time, the bandwidth to really give that the thought that it deserves. And frankly, they're not into the weeds in that way of how will the agreement be implemented, what will that impact. That's really in the administration's court. But I think having kind of a singular, again, high level, something that can be agreed on by 55 ambassadors, which I understand is probably a little challenging to get that much consensus on a letter, I think would be a really, really useful tool in your advocacy. And then, again, who are those key members and what does it mean? What are the impacts it would have on their state, on their district's economy, and having kind of a supplemental fact sheet that you could have with that letter specific to that member, I think would be very useful. And I agree with the ambassador's comments on critical minerals and supply chains. Supply chains, and again, I would lean into the China angle of this. Since COVID, the United States is extremely concerned about the concentration of our supply chain that goes through China. And so to the extent that you can say this will help, diversify supply chains, create more stability for the United States, frankly, a lot of members are concerned that there could be an impending war between the US and China, and what happens if then that supply chain gets cut off. I wouldn't go that far into that, but knowing that, how can you say, okay, Africa can be a reliable partner, can provide alternative sources, especially for the critical minerals. That's what the critical mineral conversation really comes down to, that all of these minerals are processed in China. They go into advanced weapons. They're part of our defense. And if we're in war with China, they could stranglehold that. So that's what members are thinking when and the administration too, when they're so preoccupied and why they're so preoccupied with critical minerals. It's with that consideration in mind. So, but I think it applies to other things besides, critical minerals too. You saw during the pandemic, all sorts of shortages on many consumer goods. So I think the extent that you can kind of play up that we can help diversify supply chains, because at the end of the day, while the Trump administration claims they want to onshore all these industries and bring them to the United States, economically, it makes no sense. It would drive up costs significantly, moving industry from China to the US, from Mexico to the US, from all of these other places. The labor costs here are too high. So the extent you can provide Africa as a reliable alternative, I think is very useful.
I think, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for these practical suggestions. In fact, the last session of this workshop is on the way forward. And you mentioned one key of them is the letter that can be signed by, I presume, practically by the Dean and regional Dean of the African Diplomatic Corps to the key member of Congress, a practice that we did, in fact, being here in 2015, where we brought each letter to each member, I can tell you. Embassies were mobilized. Each member of Congress and Senate was provided that letter. So this is very practical. And my dear friend Leard, we discussed it a few days ago on exactly this idea, and he's more than happy and willing to help us on drafting. Well, just last remark, I think a paper, you've been on the Hill, you go to the member of Congress or staffer with one pager on the argument that we are developing today from an America First lenses and perspective. So without further ado, I want to thank you very much, Elizabeth, for taking the time, for sharing your wisdom and experience with all of us, for your contribution. And please join me in thanking Elizabeth. Now Ambassador, we have the second panel, which is also as important as the first one, and I would like to invite my dear friend Leard, Whitney, and Paul to the stage. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Excellencies, charges, friends, colleagues, welcome to day 2. Thank you very much for coming back. And I want to congratulate the first panel for some great suggestions. We will try and actually maybe build on yesterday's discussions. You heard from both Corporate Council on Africa as well as the U.S. Chamber, and from Tony Carroll from Carnegie. Frankly, you got kind of a 30,000-foot level, if you will, of what private sector thinks and kind of their view of a lot of this. We talked about how a lot of these issues play together at a 10 to 30,000 foot level. If you will allow me, I think what I would suggest today is that we will perhaps get into some more details. And I will confess to you, so I am still learning trade policy. I'm in my, I guess, 15th or 20th year of trying to learn all this. I am delighted to have 2 experts with me on the panel who are well ahead of me. The details really matter. They can become mind-numbing. And so I think what we will do today is to try and dive in just enough so that you understand the key details, while also perhaps then focusing on what the broader message is and what the implications of some of that might be for strategies that you can consider both to advance your own country's interests as well as Africa writ large. So I think before I get into, I will propose a very short agenda, because I think we would like to hear from you. I will suggest, so with your, I guess with your blessing and agreement, indulgence, I would like to end by 11:30, and so I think maybe if we might perhaps give you, let's say, 30, 35 minutes of comments. I suspect there may be some, we would like to entertain some questions, et cetera. And so I think on the timing, that's what I would suggest. I will offer one brief comment on, as an American former or recovering policymaker, I realize a lot of attention currently is being focused on critical minerals. As we get into this discussion, I would note that a lot of the trade between the U.S. and Africa, and even more of the investment, has not really been in the critical minerals space. And I think arguably there's an incredible amount of opportunity today as well as in the future that is outside of the critical minerals space. And so as important as today's kind of shiny object, if you will, of critical minerals may be, I would underscore the importance of perhaps also widening that lens to include other key sectors. And in fact, I would suggest to you that the African Union's priority sectors in terms of automotives, pharmaceutical/medical, agriculture, and infrastructure, including information communications technologies, all offer some pretty important areas for potential cooperation, in that they're all areas of traditional U.S. commercial strength. And the one other sector that arguably should be there, I think, would be the textile and apparel. So perhaps with that general sense, what I'd like to do is, as mentioned, just get a little bit more of a deep dive in terms of what are some of the specifics of the tariffs that we're talking about, and then maybe get into a little bit of what the outlook might be. You got some sense of that outlook yesterday. I think Whitney and Paul may have some different views that will be important for you to hear in terms of what the prospects are, and then we'll conclude with maybe some specific recommendations. Given that, Paul, if I could maybe start with you, just in terms of, there's been a lot of talk about quote-unquote AGOA, and then also the general issue of the reciprocal tariffs, et cetera. Could you provide the audience maybe with a layman's introduction to what are these various tariffs? So as an exporter from Africa, or as a U.S. importer, what are the numbers you're looking at? How does that all add up?
Thank you, Laird. I'm happy to do that. Before I turn to that, though, let me just introduce myself.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm Paul Rehberg. I'm a practicing international trade lawyer here in Washington. I'm also the president of the African Coalition for Trade, which is an association of African private sector groups doing business under AGOA. We have been the primary spokesperson for the African private sector since before AGOA existed. In fact, we created ACT, as we call it, for the specific purpose of lobbying on behalf of the African private sector for what ultimately became AGOA. We started doing that in 1995, which shows you, Laird alluded to this, that Whitney and I have been at this a long time. In fact, I think we're the only two people in the room who have been at it since the beginning. And I'm reminded of Aaron Burr's song from the musical Hamilton. He wants to be in the room where it happened. Well, we were, and we know where all the skeletons are, and we can come back to that. But before I turn to the tariffs, I want to give a little bit of historical background. The last two times that major AGOA legislation was before Congress, it took until almost the last minute. In 2012, the third country fabric rule of origin was up for renewal, and it was renewed in mid-August with a September 30 expiration. In 2015, the entire program was up for renewal, and it was renewed at the end of June. Well, we have gone beyond both of those dates, but we still have 5 weeks left, and we still have a chance to accomplish our goal of renewing AGOA. So turning to your question about the tariffs, in the prior iteration of world trade, we had what was known as MFN, Most Favored Nation, or NTR, Normal Trade Relations tariffs. And the whole theory of this, going to the GATT of 1948, was that you would treat everybody equally, have one rule that everyone would follow. That no longer exists. We now have a completely different tariff system. Maybe someday we'll go back to a WTO, but at the moment the WTO is essentially irrelevant. We now have imposed a minimum baseline tariff on everything of 10%. On top of that, we have imposed so-called reciprocal tariffs on those countries with which either the United States was running a trade deficit or with which the United States has, for one reason or another, decided to impose what are in essence sanctions. And the two leading examples of that are Brazil and India, both of whom are subject to 50% tariffs. These, in almost all instances, these baseline or reciprocal tariffs apply on top of the pre-existing MFN tariffs, which is known in the new trade parlance as stacking. So in the sector that I deal with most frequently, which is textiles and apparel, the two basic MFN tariffs are for cotton apparel and man-made fiber or synthetic apparel. For cotton apparel, it is 16%. For man-made fiber, it's 32%. For AGOA beneficiaries, as long as AGOA is in effect, those tariffs do not apply. So we start with 0. Everybody else starts with 16 and 32, and then depending on whether you have a trade deficit or a trade surplus or are being sanctioned, you stack the additional tariff on top of that. So in the case of Kenya, which does not have a trade deficit with which the U.S. does not have a trade deficit with Kenya, the 10% baseline tariff applies. The 16% does not apply. If AGOA expires, the tariff from apparel from Kenya will go from 10% to 26%. And for man-made fiber, it will go from 10% to 42%. In the case of Madagascar, which has, fortunately, and a major accomplishment, reduced the tariff level from 47% to 15%. The tariff is currently 16 and 32. It will go to 31 and 47 if AGOA expires. For most countries that are currently manufacturing apparel for export to the United States under AGOA, tariff rates of that magnitude are unsustainable. When AGOA first started, almost everything coming out of Africa was cotton apparel. Today, more than half is man-made fiber. So we're looking at the 32 plus 15, 47%. That's unsustainable. To put this into perspective, the reason these apparel industries exist is because of the duty preference created by AGOA. More than 80% of the apparel being imported into the United States from Africa is coming in duty-free under AGOA. You take away AGOA, you take away 80% of the trade. The top priority has to be renewing AGOA. Further negotiations on the tariff are important, but secondary, because we're looking for almost all African countries, with unfortunately the notable exception of South Africa. We're looking at either 10 or 15%, and that is survivable. That's almost the new normal. But if you add the MFN tariffs on top of that, it becomes unsustainable. In my opinion, it is a strategic error to link the tariff negotiations and AGOA renewal. Tariff negotiations have to come after AGOA has been renewed. The tariff negotiations, while it's important and certainly needs to be done, is going to take months and months and months, if not years, to conclude. As I said, we have 5 weeks to renew AGOA. I think that you risk distracting attention from the more pressing issue. If you link the two, you need to be talking specifically only about AGOA renewal, and then once that has been accomplished, come back and talk about negotiating down the tariffs. My organization started working on AGOA renewal 2.5 years ago, specifically because we did not want to end up where we are right now, but we ended up here anyway. And we are working with a coalition of like-minded stakeholders, including the Corporate Council on Africa. We have been actively lobbying Congress. Another key member of our group is the American Apparel and Footwear Association. My members basically are the manufacturing side of the equation. The AAFA members are the importing side of the business transaction. We are mostly, but not exclusively, focused on textiles and apparel, because Corporate Council brings in the entire spectrum. But we are planning, as Ambassador Christopher mentioned, we're planning a lobbying blitz starting as soon as Congress comes back into session. We will have a series of meetings on the Hill, and with both principals and senior staff. I agree, meeting with staff is usually even more important than meeting with principals. But when the chairman of the Finance Committee says he wants to talk to you, you go talk to the chairman of the Finance Committee. So we are actively involved in that, and we've been collaborating very closely with the African embassies that have been most involved with AGOA, and we will continue to do that. The so-called T4 or T5 countries, the textile countries, and we will hopefully we will be able to convince Congress to renew AGOA. One of the really frustrating things that we have encountered over the last 8 months since the election has been that there is really still strong support in Congress for renewing AGOA. Not just once in December, but 3 times we were that close to getting AGOA included in must-pass legislation. And each time the White House said no. They never did it because they are opposed to AGOA. They did it because they didn't want to clutter up their legislation with one trade provision, which will then attract another, and before you know it, it becomes a trade package. So we are dealing with the frustration of good support in Congress and lack of support from the administration. In fact, it has been a classic situation of Congress telling us we cannot renew AGOA unless the White House will sign it, and the White House saying, oh, we don't have anything to do with the legislative process, you need to talk to Congress. So you need to pursue both avenues, and we are doing that. We have tried unsuccessfully to have a meeting with Masad Boulos, but I agree he is really a key player. I've gone on far too long and covered far too much in answering your very straightforward question, but I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. Paul, thank you very much. And maybe just to correct my oversight, just as I suspect Whitney may not need a lot of introduction, but just a very brief introduction. We are very privileged to have truly one of those who were actually in the room, and in fact, Whitney was in a key position in the Department of State getting this over the line when AGOA was actually enacted, and since enactment has advised companies, both investors and importers and exporters, and so a unique perspective. Whitney, I wonder perhaps if I could ask you, kind of based on your understanding of the genesis of AGOA, which was certainly never a charity program. It was done because it was, in the strategic interests of the United States, as deemed at the time. Maybe if you could perhaps reflect on Paul's comment that perhaps we're in a well, I don't think you said Bretton Woods, but we're in a new environment, maybe a new regime. Just kind of based on your perspective, Whitney, how are you seeing the advent of where are we on trade policy, and how does Africa fit into that?
Great.
Thanks, Larry. And Your Excellencies, it's a pleasure and honor to be here to speak about AGOA with my friends and colleagues, Paul, who we've been at it for some time. Thanks, Larry. Before I get to sort of the post-AGOA, let me just respond to some of the points that have been made by Paul and Elizabeth, because I think a lot has been put on the table, and I just want to double-click on a number of those based on my experience. As Paul said, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President Clinton, and I was appointed in 1997. This carbon dates me, but AGOA was on the move in Congress, and I was responsible for commercial and economic issues in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of my key jobs as a DAS, as I interpreted it, was to get AGOA passed. So I said to myself, I'm going to do something every day to get AGOA passed. And that meant talking to the African Diplomatic Corps, getting on planes to talk to companies in Chicago and California and Texas. Whoever would take time to talk to me, I wanted to talk to them about the passage of AGOA. And I think we're in that mode now for the next 34 days, right, of flooding the zone, as it were. I just want to mention, the idea, the ambassador from Madagascar, the idea of a strategic paper. I think a one-pager that really hits on some of the key issues is highly relevant at this point. Elizabeth brought up China. Indeed, in 2000, the U.S. was Africa's largest trading partner. That changed in 2009 when China overtook the U.S. Today, U.S. two-way trade with Africa is about $60, $70 billion. China's approaching $300 billion. And there's just data out today. And I think capturing that, how we're losing the African continent as a market, is really a message that should be conveyed to the Hill. On top of that, if you dig into the data, you'll find that there are exports from each of the 50 states in the U.S. going to Africa. And again, I think who are the largest exporters in the United States to sort of work with the trade associations in those states of New York. I can tell you of New York, California, of Texas, of Georgia, working with the mayors of the largest cities of Atlanta and others to amplify the voices of why AGOA is beneficial to America is really quite critical. You know, when we were getting AGOA passed in 1999 and 2000, one of the most important voices was your voices. Ambassador Robley Ohai, who was a dear friend, was Dean of the Diplomatic Corps at the time. He was the ambassador from Djibouti. And there's a lot of controversy. I mean, even some of the most reliable partners didn't think AGOA was a good idea. But Ambassador Ohai got a letter together, and indeed it was signed by each of the ambassadors. And I think that kind of presentation is really quite compelling. And the letter was sent to Senator Jesse Helms to show him the strength of Africa's support for this legislation. He didn't vote for it, but AGOA was passed. So, as he said, you're not going to get everybody, but certainly making. He removed his hold, though. Right. But you know, somebody else who was very critical to AGOA's passage was Newt Gingrich. He was the Speaker of the House at the time, and he got up on the floor of the House and spoke to AGOA, why AGOA was important for the U.S., why AGOA was important for Africa. And it may be worthwhile to reach out to Speaker Johnson and just remind him of the important role that the Speaker of the House played in AGOA's initial passage, and that can be played again. Because if we don't have it, we're certainly going to lose one of our most important instruments of commercial power and soft power. My dear friend Rosa Whitaker likes to point out that AGOA is the most inexpensive development program ever devised, and the cost is minimal, negligible to the United States, and I think that's another important point that should go into the strategic paper. What else? I think just reading from the press, Paul referred to like the T5, right? The apparel countries getting together as groups. I know the Kenyan minister has been here proposing free trade, resurrecting the free trade negotiations. I think that's all very important, showing the administration the different types of partnership that are available with African nations. Yes, we want AGOA. You look at the enabling legislation, and it names all the then 48, today it's 49 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. This legislation is still relevant, very relevant to the U.S. and U.S. interests. And I think underscoring that is quite critical. We can talk about beyond AGOA. Again, I think we're seeing some interesting things. The Libido Corridor is a model, but with all due respect, I've sort of, recalibrated. I just think we need to focus on the 34 days that we have available to us. I agree with the notion that nostalgia is not a strategy, nor is hope, but hard work is. And I think we still have time to do this. I guess my last point, focuses on the business associations. I know Kendra was here, obviously CCA, I'm honored to be on the board of CCA, work closely with Laird and Flory. I think don't be shy of making asks of us, of these organizations. And they're very robust business associations in Africa. KEPSA, Kenya Private Sector Association, is incredibly switched on an active organization. In Ghana, there's AmChams. There's 600 U.S. businesses in South Africa. And to be honest with you, I have yet to hear from them. I think they're a really important voice that needs to be heard. These are U.S. companies. These are major U.S. companies that many of them have been on the African continent for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. They need to be in this dialogue. And I'll just, name one name, Chevron. We have many friends who work there. Chevron's been in Angola for 70 years. Chevron was so critical to the passage of AGOA in 2000. And they said, look, we're not going to benefit from it. Oil doesn't come in. We're not going to benefit. But it is important for the U.S.-African relationship. So I think just mobilizing the leaderships of all the major companies, of the digital corporations, of the energy corporations, sectors you don't normally think of. Apparel's obviously important, but we need to go beyond that and really mobilize the constituency, the American constituency for Africa. And I think we can get it done.
Whitney, I'm worried. That sounds almost like a note of optimism.
Yeah, and I meant to be really pessimistic. I came prepared to be Debbie Downer, but I just realized, we can talk about what happens next come October 1st when we know what the deal is. Because, Paul referred to, I think, was it 2015 or 2008? AGOA actually expired, but then it was retroactive several months. And he's looking at me like it didn't happen. I think it happened, right? You see, recall. I like this. My recall against his recall. So it's okay. So let's just go for it, and then we can reconvene afterwards.
Super. So I will kind of looking at the time, and I do want to give you time to ask our esteemed panelists some questions, but maybe kind of a departure question, a point of departure question for both of you. So I think what you're hearing is a very clear recommendation. Please focus the next 33 and a half days on securing the passage of AGOA on time. And I share Paul's understanding that it's never expired before, and this would be a terrible precedent to have it expire now. So with the CR being the likely vehicle, with the asterisks we talked about yesterday, so obviously job one, focus on renewing AGOA. But maybe to get your recommendations on that second part, so the if you will, the here and now beyond AGOA of on October 1st, do you have some suggestions in terms of strategies to pursue, key points to kind of make to keep the discussion going? I think perhaps, Paul, borrowing your framing for while these ongoing bilateral tariff negotiations continue, if they continue, et cetera, but I think also as Africa itself looks to try and develop a stronger, I think we heard more reciprocal framework for trade and investment. Whitney, I know you've been doing a lot of work on some regional associations and approaches. So perhaps if each of you had just a couple of minutes of specific suggestions for October 1st.
Yes, but first, you've prompted a thought. For the last 2.5 years, we have been arguing, and the AU and the African Diplomatic Corps has also been arguing for a minimum of 10-year renewal of AGOA. I think times have changed, and the signal that we're getting from both the administration and Congress is that a long-term renewal is not in the cards, that a short-term renewal is possible, and we're talking about probably 1 or 2 years. The reason being that the White House, when they will do more than just point to somebody else, has said that changes need to be made to AGOA to make it more consistent with the Trump trade policy. They have been in internal interagency deliberations for 8 months now to come up with what that policy for AGOA is, and they still don't have a blueprint for what they want in AGOA. So the point of a short-term renewal is to have an opportunity to come back after October 1 with some ideas about how to make AGOA more consistent with the U.S. Trade policy. And that whole process, I think, is driven by the point that several people have stated previously, and that is how important it is to emphasize the benefits to the United States from AGOA. We have run some studies and determined that something like 300,000 U.S. jobs are linked to U.S.-Africa back and forth trade. Also, U.S. exports to Africa have increased over the past 25 years by a higher margin than African exports to the United States have increased. So there are clearly benefits on the business side of the equation, not to mention the fundamentally important impact on the competition between the U.S. and China in Africa. And quite frankly, AGOA is the only policy left. There's nothing else left in the U.S. Playbook for counterbalancing China's influence. So having said all that, and now turning to your question, or no, I'm not going to turn to it yet. I have one more point. And that is that our alliance has come up with some ideas for improving AGOA. Others have come up with even more fundamental ideas on improving AGOA. My advice to you is put that aside. No changes but the date. We just want to renew AGOA long enough to be able to come back next year and start debating the substance. If we start raising ways to improve AGOA now, you might as well just kiss it goodbye. It will not be renewed. There's no way they can do a really substantive bill. So, having not answered your question, I'll turn the floor back.
Paul, thank you very much. Whitney, would you like to either answer or not answer the question?
Yeah. I think Paul just made a big point. We just want to extend AGOA. There are many of the view that like 1 year or 2 years, what would that do? Contracts are not going to come back. Orders are not going to come back in a 12-month time. But to Paul's deeper point, that gives us more time to really engage the administration to get that new framework in place that is mutually beneficial. Just one quote. On August 7th, Jameson Greer had a piece in the New York Times about the administration's new U.S. trade policy. In one quote, he says, "By using a mix of tariffs and deals for foreign market access and investment, the United States has laid the foundation for a new global trading order." Another way to read this, in my view, is that the U.S. will use tariffs to extract the best commercial and national security deal that it can from each of its trading partners globally, including in Africa. So this is where this administration is going. They want to know, what are you doing for us? It's not, it's no longer us just doing it for you or even with you. It's like, what are you doing for us? That has to be part of the equation. And I guess my last point, you look to where the administration is putting its commercial and diplomatic effort in Africa, and it is in the DRC. On August 1, DRC and Rwanda concluded a regional economic and integration framework agreement. And this framework includes cooperation in energy, infrastructure, mineral supply chains, national parks, and public health. So that's how this administration is thinking. What are the critical sectors? What are the critical countries? How do I get there? And what are you going to do for me? Because I'm, frankly, tired of just doing it all for you. That's not how I see it, but that's how they see it. And that's the game. That's the conversation that we need to have.
Thank you very much for that. Exercising moderator's privilege, I think maybe just building on those suggestions, just to make the observation that, to my knowledge, Africa as the African Union or as regions has never actually presented the United States with, shall we say, a framework or here's what a long-term partnership might look like. I would, as a recovering Foreign Service officer, might just suggest to you, you've received a lot of démarches and negotiating approaches, etc. Nothing says you have to remain in receive mode. So perhaps as you consider October 1st and kind of beyond, there may well be some opportunity to perhaps change the narrative, to change the trope a little bit, to make some of this point that, look, there is a lot of value that should be had for both sides in a deeper, ideally more reciprocal trade and investment relationship. And again, I think with great respect to my former colleagues inside the U.S. government, I was delighted to hear Elizabeth's assertion that there is an Africa policy. I think that may be, if there is one, it's pretty thin gruel, and so I think it's high time, perhaps, that some attention be given to that. I think, to Whitney's point, that this administration, obviously, I think would look to focus on kind of first and foremost the trade and investment piece of that, but I think that might give you a framework into which to build more items. I promised we would try and give you some time, so maybe 15, 20 minutes or so for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Lord. Just one quick question, because we heard a lot about potential extension of deadline for 1 or 2 years. So my question is it subject to vote at Congress when we talk about extension of deadline? It's a question.
Yes. The ordinary approach is for Congress to amend the statute to extend it. It may be theoretically possible for the president to extend duty-free status by executive order. I think that is a practical impossibility. There's no way that President Trump would extend AGOA by executive order. It has to be done by Congress.
Well, and I think also I would agree with that. I think kind of as noted yesterday, there are legal frameworks, and certainly if Congress amends the trade legislation, namely the AGOA Authorization Act, then there's no question that Congress had the authority to do that. The other nice thing about it is everybody, so not just countries, but also companies, then have a clear sense of they can find it on the web, they know what the terms are, et cetera. And so I think for a lot of reasons, that's actually probably more solid ground.
And just to underscore, I agree with Paul. It's not going to be done by executive order. It has to be done by a vote. But there's no question of the centrality of the White House in this. And I guess my reading of why the continuing resolution didn't get done in 2022, a little different from Elizabeth. I heard that, the Trump administration said, no, just hold it. And so it was no. So how do you get the White House to yes? I don't have a magic answer, but I think a lot of focus needs to be there. And key cabinet secretaries, Commerce and Treasury in particular.
Are there other questions or challenges, observations? Please, sir.
Allow me to pay special tribute to our three panelists for the insightful and thought-provoking presentations as it relates to the AGOA negotiations. I have two questions. The first question is, how will the U.S. balance its economic interest with geopolitical priorities, particularly regarding China, in the stalled AGOA renewal negotiations? That's one. The question number two is the aspect of differing priorities. By that I mean, from all indications, it appears that the U.S. and African countries have different priorities for AGOA renewal, which may complicate potential negotiations. How do we African countries navigate this hurdle? Thank you.
Whitney, you want to take a crack at the China side?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. We've touched on the China issue, and in a sense, I had a personal experience in the Democratic Republic of the Congo when I was at Covington and Burling, where I was for 10 years until 2 years ago. And I was very involved in Freeport's exit from the sale of Tenke Fungurume by Freeport McMoran to China Molybdenum. So I've been very focused. Freeport's exit, there's been virtually no U.S. commercial interest in the DRC's mining sector until now. And this is what this administration, in my view, has been successful at doing. There's just press today that Cobalt has been granted some lithium licenses to begin work. So the U.S. Mining industry is beginning to look again at the DRC. Companies are coming back. And this goes directly, why are they coming back? Because the U.S. recognizes that China has dominance in DRC's mining sector. They have dominance of the cobalt. They have dominance of the copper. And that puts the U.S. at risk. So that's why you've seen this administration so focused on the DRC and going a step further, not just commercial, trying to pursue peace as well. So that's, in my mind, very reflective of how this administration thinks about Africa. Where are the U.S. interests? Where are their national security interests? And how are we going to capture those? Now, I would make an argument that virtually all African countries have value to the United States, but it's really up to you all to articulate that to the United States as a group and individually. I'm doing work in Sierra Leone, and small country, but they're making a really strong push to engage the United States, and it's being successful. I'm sure it's happening with other countries that I'm not that involved in actively right now. But as I mentioned earlier, the Libido Corridor Initiative is very important. Started by Biden, continued under Trump, because it's in the U.S. interest, and that's the framework that I think we're moving into, or that we are into, when it comes to trade deals. And then you bring in the tariffs and access to U.S. market.
Whitney, thank you. Maybe if I could just build on one small example. If we reach back in distant memory to the first Trump administration, one of the key focuses of at least the interagency was China's dominance in telecommunications networks. And there was a real argument about where is the United States investment in subsea cables, et cetera. Those are things that don't happen. If you will, that was the 6 years ago equivalent of critical minerals today. It's been interesting. Something like $10 billion of U.S. company investment have now gone in, and so Amazon, Google, others have these game-changing cables that are now present. It's interesting, you don't read that much about them kind of day in, day out, but they are making a huge difference to these companies now that AI is really growing globally with this access, and then also arguably to the African countries with landing points, et cetera. So there are some of these things where I guess this is, a little bit of kind of my point of China certainly has been playing a long-term game of a patient investor. And I think the point is, if the United States is interested in playing in the same kind of field, it also needs the longer-term investment. Paul, would you like to address the AGOA strategy?
Well, I will. In fact, your questions are sort of two sides of the same coin. On one hand, it is how does the U.S. reconcile its conflicting interests, and on the other side of the coin, it was how does Africa come up with a unified and common position? And my answer is going to be controversial and perhaps not welcome, but I find it very difficult to know how you can. When you are dealing with this administration, because this administration has a bilateral transactional philosophy. They are by and large not interested in overreaching policy issues. They want to extract the best deal that they can, and they do that on a bilateral basis. So any future negotiations will probably be bilateral, not AU and the US, and they will be focused on what each individual country has to offer, those with critical minerals, those with products that are not made in, tropical products that are not produced in the United States, whatever it is that you can put on the table. So I think it will be very difficult to come up with a unified negotiating approach.
Okay, thank you. Other, please, Lesotho.
Thank you. I wish I could have some optimism, in the next, for the remaining 30 days or so. But at the same time, I want to be pragmatic, and acknowledge the landscape. I'm looking at the fact that for the first time, maybe in a long time, Congress has to a certain extent lost its independence. The president has immense influence over the current Congress. Congress has lost its ability to make decisions as it's supposed to be, to make these decisions independently. And in that respect, whilst I support the strategy of engaging Congress fully over the next couple of weeks, I'm not sure if that will give it as the result we want if the administration doesn't send correct signals to Congress. I want to suspect that Congress, if they don't get anything from White House that says, yes, move ahead, renew AGOA, I doubt that Congress would, on its own, unilaterally give the extension of AGOA. And when I look at White House on the other side, I'm afraid that up to now, I don't think Africa is a priority. Truth be told, it's down the pecking order. And in the next couple of weeks, as we discussed yesterday, the only available vehicle would be the CR. But when I look at the politics around CR, I'm doubtful that the White House would accommodate inclusion of AGOA in the CR. There are a lot of domestic politics going on, and that I suspect will be going on throughout the month of September, and that will require preferential attention from both White House and Congress. Even if we were to extend to the foreign affairs landscape, still during the month of September, there are other more pressing foreign policy issues that I think this administration would rather give more attention to instead of Africa or and AGOA by extension. So my question would be, how would we convince White House? I think that's the main critical player right now. Ordinarily it should be Congress, but at this moment, in my humble opinion, White House is more important. How do we convince White House now? How do we get their attention first? And convince them on the importance of AGOA to their broader agenda, in these 30 days, I can tell you that if you can convince White House, tomorrow you'll get a post on Truth Social that says that AGOA should be extended, and right away Congress will follow suit, Otherwise, if we keep going up to the hill, we'll go there until the 30th, And if there's no cue from the White House, on the 1st of October, there will be nothing. Thank you.
Ambassador Masutu, thank you very much for, as usual, zooming in on the most critical issue. I defer to Whitney and Paul if they have the magic answer on convincing Trump. I think what I might offer you is one thing that is the thin gruel of what we've been hearing for the last couple of months. So for 6 months, we've been highlighting to both the administration and to Paul the very annoying report back we hear from Ways and Means Committee, basically saying as soon as we get a green light, we'll move ahead from the administration, and then the administration insisting, it's got to be Congress. And it's like, stop, please. You're in the same city. We will buy lunch if the two of you, what does a signal need? We've been hearing in the last 2 or 3 weeks that the White House now, the White House, never a name associated, but that somebody in the White House apparently understands and that there is some appropriate signal coming. We've been hearing this for at least a month. That perhaps a statement of administration policy would come out that Chairman Jason Smith could point to if members of his caucus complained or whatever. He could say, well, look, here's better than a tweet here's this statement on the White House website. This would deal particularly with AGOA and with Haiti Hope, which is in the same boat and has its own kind of constituency who has the same concerns and is making the same arguments. I think the simple answer is we're going to find out in 10 days or so I think our feeling is as we go to meet with members and with staff, that will be the road test of have they received whatever this bat signal, whatever the mysterious required sign is. And if not, then I think our sense is we will feed that back into White House administration, et cetera, with, you need to increase the wattage or, whatever you've done, maybe use the phone or call somebody, something. But so completely agree with you on that. I also completely agree with your implicit, so I think there's the issue of a signal, but then there's where the rubber meets the road is after Congress passes something, which might take them a week or two, et cetera, will the president sign it, which is the other kind of critical piece. Nice to have it on his desk, but does it get the signature? And that's where I think there is, your missions in particular, looking at the rich schedule of heads of state that are coming for UN General Assembly, as well as pre-General Assembly, post-General Assembly, visits, phone calls, etc. That's where I think you may be uniquely positioned in terms of president to president, in some ways sort of like the West African presidents, where at least one of them, two of them raised, but Mr. President, what about AGOA? And they got a vague answer, but at least it was a non-no. And so I think it's a combination of those approaches.
Yeah, if I can weigh in just briefly, the key congressional staffers have told me he doesn't have to say yes. He just has to say something other than no. they really want to renew AGOA. And as long as they have the slightest encouragement, or at least not opposition, they will do it. Coming back to the real nub of your question, Massad Boulos. Who do we talk to try to get the White House on board? Massad Boulos. He has tremendous business interests in Nigeria. That's the approach. I don't see Nigeria in the room, but that's how you do it.
If I might add to one thing, I would encourage talk to everyone, and the other piece of it is, I think, in many ways, so one thing that we're trying to do, we are talking to as many importers beyond textile and apparel as we can, in the strong belief that we may not know the right people, but some of these CEOs, so someone mentioned Target we know in places like Tennessee, et cetera, that if Kenya no longer exports certain products, that there will be no surgical gowns in Tennessee. And so if the CEO of the company in Tennessee happens to be in Mar-a-Lago, so in some cases there are some, it's not who you know necessarily, it's who knows about the issue and can deliver the message of, I need this, don't say no, et cetera. So I would, no disrespect to Mr. Boulos, certainly really important to reach out to him, but anyone that you run across or that your capitals have access to or your importers have access to, I think now is the time. I think we're down to maybe one last question. Oh, please, Tarek. Or
first, thank you very much for those insightful comments. Mine is about an engagement strategy. I think everyone is doing everything, but it's not very targeted. And I think we need to have like a list of people we need to engage and assign a lead per name of who to engage. Because with a limited time, for example, we're talking about these private sector companies. Yeah, private sector companies, you're talking about a list of over 20 companies. One embassy, one mission, AU by itself cannot do it by themselves. Yeah. But if we split roles and responsibilities on how to engage, first the US private sector, there's two, the Hill, who'll engage, who'll be available for those meetings. Three, in terms of the key influential people that we need to engage with, like Ambassador Boulos. And also, actually, another name that doesn't come out strongly is Ambassador Paulo, who's is a special envoy of international partnerships. Yeah, all these are very influential people, very close, and also have business interests. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one thing that we've not put together, and I'm not sure who's going to support us to put in an engagement matrix. Then we have a very clear way forward of how to deliver this. I'd like your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So perhaps just to, sure, please, go ahead.
Ambassador, I think it's a short list, to be honest with you. To the point of the ambassador from Lesotho, I think the goal should be truth social. I mean, how do you get this broad support? Even if you don't get there, you're going to get the signal sent. And I think it is Boulos, it is Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, Jameson Greer, and just focusing on these people. You mentioned Ambassador Paulo, him too. The Deputy Secretary of State is very involved in African issues, who works for Secretary Rubio. I think just focusing on these key individuals to assure that the White House is not going to say no is an excellent way to spend your energy, and also who knows these people, who can get the message there. And I think time spent on that targeted focus list that would go into Trump and his closest advisors would pay the largest dividends.
Ambassador, maybe if I can just on behalf of the Area Alliance, the AGOA Renewal and Enhancement Alliance, we've been working on a list. We have a list of targeted Hill outreaches. And I think it's actually probably a good point that maybe we should add a few of the administration folks. I think we've been talking to a lot of, maybe not the principals, but the staff. We certainly could forward that to Tarek in terms of keeping you up to date as to who we're targeting and also kind of what we're hearing. We are, frankly, we have an informal network as CCA, kind of on behalf of area of the various commercial associations and groups that we know. We're happy to share kind of who those are. We're literally in the process of trying to pull this together. I think we'd be happy to add to that, if that makes sense, if it's kind of strategy sessions, if it's briefing sessions, et cetera. Happy to do that. I suspect there may be others, other organizations doing the same kind of thing. And so we're happy to share, I think, kind of what we're doing and keep looking for friends would be my advice. I think we may have time just for Tarek.
No, thank you very much. In fact, I'll be very short. First, I want to thank you very much, the three of you, for your participation and for your engagement that you have always showed to us. And your insights, advice are very valuable, and we will capture all of them. I think beyond September 30th, I believe that there is an opportunity for a regional continental approach to the US-Africa relationship. Whitney, you've been dealing with Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I think beyond September, it's a continental one. And even the selective transactional approach, I think it fits the regional and continental approach. If you take it even from the perspective of the Rwanda DRC peace agreement, I think that approach where the African Union is playing a key role in terms of the peace and security lever, but also the regional economic dimension. So I think the paradigm needs to be changed after September 30th towards a regional continental. This is my message. I want to thank you very much. I'm indebted to your support since I started here. Thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much for your attention.